Good evening and welcome. My name is Amada Sandoval, and I'm the Associate Dean for Engagement, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Sarah Lawrence. I'm delighted to welcome you tonight. Each year, the college selects a theme to explore through campus-wide events and conversations, and our theme for this year is justice. Through this lens, we're confronting as a community the inequities in our society and world that are being dramatically reinscribed by the COVID-19 pandemic and made apparent through the global protests against racism and police brutality in the wake of the violent deaths within the past year of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, to name a few. Recognizing that, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are also taking a hard look at our own community, our environment, structures, practices, educational model, to understand our own role in perpetuating or dismantling social injustice. I'm pleased to introduce President Cristle Judd, who will be in conversation with our esteemed guest this evening. And lastly, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Eddie Glaude, Jr., and I'm honored to do so. Eddie and I first met as grad students when I was beginning my studies and he had just completed his. I have followed his career and writing in the years since Eddie returned to Princeton University as a tenured faculty member, currently head of the Department of African American Studies. And through these years, Eddie has, with his brilliant writing, incisive commentary, unflinching honesty, and excellent scholarship, become one of our nation's most important public intellectuals. Eddie is frequently a guest on the morning show, on Morning Joe show on MSNBC and others, and he's the author of several books and edited volumes, perhaps most notably Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and most recently, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Eddie's influence stretches far beyond academic circles and is sustained by something much more immediate than academic titles and accolades, of which he has plenty. Eddie reaches people from all backgrounds because he writes and speaks with a strong and open heart. Eddie engages his materials, his audience, and interlocutors with true humanity and with his full presence. In his latest book, as in other writings, Eddie shares with us the beautiful and painful impact of James Baldwin's words on his own heart and mind. And he invites us to hear Baldwin deeply and to struggle and hope with him as an American, as a human being, and also as a parent. I remember being struck by an exchange of letters between Eddie and his son Langston, which was published in Time magazine in 2016. In it, Eddie harkens back to Baldwin's 1964 essay, The Uses of the Blues, and the truth Baldwin notes that in every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself. As he ponders this heartbreaking question in the presence of his son through the letters, Eddie brilliantly draws us into the immediacy of Baldwin, the urgency of Baldwin, and the eternal relevance of Baldwin. It may be that this question alone, the act of reading it and pondering it at the same time with Baldwin and with Eddie and with Langston, and the love and the pain with which Eddie shares it with his son, Langston, can open up the whole world for any reader and can spark within us the hope and the courage to make it a better one. Let's welcome Eddie Glaude Jr. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you, Amada. Thank you.
Thank you, Amada. And thank you, Eddie, so much for being with us. And thank you, Amada, for already getting for us a sense of the wonderful language and way of speaking that Eddie has. We'll be in conversation, um, Eddie and I, about his book, Begin Again, as many of you know, and about many other issues around it. Our plan this evening is that Eddie and I will go back and forth for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will open up at that point to questions from our audience. We're delighted to welcome tonight students, faculty, staff, members of our community, alumni. We're here from around the world, and so one of the upsides of this Zoom world that we're all in is that we're able to gather from so many places, so many time zones. So Eddie, it seems impossible as we start off tonight not to just begin by acknowledging this moment, um, moments in which we find ourselves in a and a litany we could all say now, right? A global pandemic which has disproportionately affected communities of color, the murder of George Floyd, our election, January 6th. And writing books takes time. You started this book in 2018, but it got put to bed, I presume, somewhere rather early in the pandemic, and and came out in the early summer. So maybe just as a way of starting us off, you could set the stage for what happened in the six months between the books coming out and your own sense of the trajectory you imagined as you finished the book and the trajectory we lived together on in these last 6 months. Um, just as a way to sort of contextualize this, and then I hope we'll go into a lot of
Sure.
places.
Well, Madam President, I'm so delighted to be here with you in conversation. We have this previous connection with Bowdoin, but we're at Sarah Lawrence, and I'm so honored. I wish I was there with you so that we could have a conversation in person. But I think that's a wonderful question to a place to begin. I was on, the George Floyd was murdered in front of us, and we all witnessed it for 8 minutes and 46 seconds on loop. And I found myself having to be uh, I found myself in the position of having to comment on it over and over and over again on MSNBC. And I found myself drawing on everything that was in the book. I, I was using languages. There was a video that I did on Nicole Wallace's Deadline White House, and it was right after the El Paso shooting. And a colleague who was on the panel with me was from El Paso, and he was literally about to collapse into tears with every answer. And I got angry, and then suddenly I started channeling something I had just literally written for the book. This is us was a riff on a passage that's actually in Begin Again. So I found myself drawing on the book. So my editor was like, Eddie, you're giving up all the goods. We have to. Da, da, da. So the book was initially supposed to come out in August, and so they pushed it up. And because they thought it was too relevant. And it led me to conclude that I knew when I decided to write the book in this way that I was speaking to something at the heart of the country, a contradiction that threatened over and over again to overwhelm the experiment, that I was addressing the serpent that loomed, right, in the dark shadows of American democracy. And so I think it's a writing with Baldwin about this, because he had me by the nape of the neck, by for the time, and it just I knew I was writing about something that mattered. I didn't know that George Floyd would frame it, but I knew that I was at the heart of the matter, if that makes sense.
And you come for us in this timing at Sarah Lawrence in the semester, and in that time in between, after George Floyd's murder, we gathered, as many campuses did, collectively to try to understand that moment. We happened to have in this series 5 days, well, no, on the Friday after the election, Doug Brinkley and I were in conversation when we
Mm,
still didn't know the outcome of the election. And and in a way, you're with us now at the first time that we collectively, as a community, as we've come back together in a couple of weeks ago for classes, to really do that processing. So I really appreciate the willingness and the help for us to engage that. And so maybe I'll take you to directly. You alluded to it, but you speak throughout the book about the lie, right? The lie at the heart of America, as Baldwin called it. And many of the people with us tonight have read your book, have read Begin Again, but there are others here who haven't. So maybe knowing that you've got that mixed audience, um, uh, can you just talk a little bit about how you thought about and confronted what Baldwin described as that lie at the heart of America, what it would take to overcome it, if it can be overcome? And you were alluding to that just a moment ago, but
Yeah, yeah. Um, you know, in my last book, Democracy in Black, I put forward this idea, this phrase, trying to give us a language to talk about the moment, right? To talk about what this vexing issue of race. And so I talked about the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others, and how this belief organizes or shapes or informs our social arrangements, our political and economic arrangements, and how this belief is not the possession simply of loud races, that it actually animates so much of our lives, even the way in which space is organized, you know? And so in the background of Democracy in Black is Jimmy. Baldwin is speaking loudly all over the book. And so I wanted to usher him on to this. Okay, Jimmy, come on. Okay. And one of the things that emerged was, okay, how is the value gap sustained? Well, we tell ourselves these untruths. We lie to ourselves in order to justify this belief that white people matter more than others. Baldwin, in a 1964 essay entitled The White Problem, put it this way, and I'm paraphrasing him here. This is on page 9 in the book, I think, where he says, the founders of this nation had a fatal flaw. They wanted to, create a democracy, these Christians and the like, but they held chattel, right? And they had to figure out the role of this chattel in their lives. And so they had to say that these people were not men and women. Because if they were men and women, then no crime, if they weren't men and women, then no crime would have been committed. And then Jimmy writes this line, and this is verbatim: that lie is the basis of our present trouble. So the way in which we talked about Black people in order to justify the institution of slavery, but more importantly, the way in which that construction is actually all about a certain construction of whiteness. America's original sin isn't slavery. America's original sin isn't the genocide of Native peoples, to my mind. America's original sin is what Baldwin called the price of the ticket. That is this becoming white and the consequences that follow from it. So the lie is this broad architecture that we tell ourselves about our inherent goodness that undergirds this kind of perfectionist impulse that allows us to say that we are the Redeemer nation, that we are an example of democracy achieved, that we are the shining city on the hill, as Reagan would add the adjective to John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, right? And all of this is really the stories we tell ourselves to evade what we've actually done and who we actually are, you see. At least that's what Baldwin was saying. And then I was just bumping into the lie everywhere. I was looking at, I came across it in the actual language in Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, came across it in King's lecture around Du Bois. I mean, it was everywhere. And so I remember submitting the chapter to my editor, and he was like, okay, the lie. All right. We have our through line. Let's go. And then we kept working from there.
so as you there's so much to take out of that in so many directions, but as you talk there, and both as you talk and as you write, um, and you're in this conversation with Jimmy. I feel like I don't have the ability to say Jimmy, but as you say, in that conversation. And so Baldwin occupies this unique space in the civil rights movement, but talk to us about who for you, James Baldwin, who Jimmy is why it's so important for us to know it right now. You've already alluded to it just then, but also take into that where and how his identity as a gay man intersects with all of it.
Yeah, that's one of the shortcomings of the book, right? Because I struggled with his sexual identity and how um, to deal with it in the context of what I was trying to do in the book. Um, but Baldwin was very clear about the intimate relationship between race, sex, and power, about how our immaturity as a nation and as individuals, right, evidences itself in the very ways in which we can't manage desire in some ways. And of course, he's always grappling with the challenge of being loved, of loving someone else and feeling unlovable at the same time, all at the same time. But Baldwin, for me, he is the most insightful critic we have of the vexing question of race and democracy in the country. So, you have de Tocqueville and you read, Democracy in America, you read both volumes, you said, this is the best, most prescient, account of American democracy we have. And then, of course, when you read de Tocqueville, you have the chapter on the three races, which is an afterthought, right? In so many ways to his account. Now that I've talked about democracy, we can talk about race. That's literally the transition almost, right, in the chapter. Baldwin places race at the heart of how we understand this fragile experiment. So in a way, he grabs Emerson around the collar and snatches him and drags him across the tracks, right? And for those of you who don't quite know what that metaphor is, the railroad tracks is that dividing line between white and Black America. So the Emersonian preoccupation with self-creation, with perfectionism, Baldwin is going to explore it within the context of this extraordinary contradiction that threatens to overwhelm the country, that threatens to overwhelm the entire thing. So for me, intellectually, he's at the heart of it all. And so as I was trying to grapple with American pragmatism, he gave me resources to queer it. That's an interesting verb to use in that moment, right? He gave me the resources to inflect it in a different direction, right? But personally, what does he mean to me personally? Um, I can only tell it by way of a story, Madam President. I'm going to keep calling you Madam President. I just love doing it.
Fine with you.
um, I was initially I wanted to write an intellectual biography, right? Baldwin is everywhere in my corporate, in my work, in my body of work. I was going to finally set it up, like I said, right? But the archive is complicated because much of his material is embargoed for the next 30 years. So you can't really write that biography. You would just be repeating everything, right? And so I had to figure out what I was going to do. I had signed this big contract and I'm a year in and I haven't written a word. I got to do something here, right? And so finally I started writing. It came to me in Heidelberg, but I was still having trouble. And I had this spirit candle with Jimmy's face and everything on it that I would light every time I would write. And it was almost as if he was like, okay, well, let me tell you something, young man, that in order to write with me, what you want to do, you're going to have to deal with you. And I had been evading Jimmy all along since graduate school because I wasn't mature enough to deal with the questions he was asking me to answer. And so I had to figure out that I'm this vulnerable little boy who still has daddy issues. And I had to grapple with those daddy issues as I was drinking my Irish whiskey, too much of it, I must admit. And suddenly the sentences started jumping off the page. And it was as if he said to me, now we're ready, young man. Let's write. So what he means to me is this example of what it means to take seriously the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living. That in order to say anything substantive about the world or the messiness of the world, I had to deal with, and I have to deal with, the messiness of me. You see, that I'm wounded, I have to deal with my pain because that's the bridge, as he would say. Our suffering is the bridge to each other.
It's extraordinary in the way that you describe that and in the way you write, of the willingness to put that vulnerability out front, right? In a way of that engagement. And many of our students are reading Baldwin now in a variety of different ways. And uh, and a variety of contexts. And you talk about sort of 30 years before you could really read Baldwin, or the ways that you deflected. But and you're working with students at Princeton, so I don't want to make you feel old, Eddie, but you've had 30 years of grappling with this, and I wonder what feedback you've seen, or what your sense of how current students are reading Baldwin in relation to the way you've read him, either in this book or in the way of engaging, whether Baldwin has is staying in what the staying power, is it one that is moving and shifting? Is it particular to our moment? Right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I was teaching a Baldwin seminar, and I tend to be attracted to his nonfiction. So I was teaching a Baldwin seminar in 2016 during the presidential election. So it was fascinating. Now I'm teaching a Baldwin seminar this semester, and students are reading him in the aftermath of the impeachment and the insurrection and the like. And just thinking about the two moments, we just finished reading Nobody Knows My Name on Tuesday, and how the students were reading him and grappling with him. And trying to understand what he's doing around sentimentality and race. How is he grappling with Richard Wright in this text as opposed to Notes of a Native Son? So there's the close reading, and then there's this sense in which at least as I'm reading them right now in their reaction, that Baldwin is saying something about race and American democracy that they haven't heard before. That he's bringing them to the core of something, to the heart of something, and he's giving it to them without, it's not pablum, right? It's fully cooked food, as it were. And I remember when we were reading the work in 2016, I remember my students who were all, because my classes are self-selecting, obviously, so most of them agree with, they have a political ideological orientation that is more than likely in line with my own. And they just kept saying over and over again, I can't believe he said this in 1955. I can't believe he said this in 1964. I can't believe he said it in 1972. I can't believe he said it in 1987. It was this kind of ongoing, oh my God. Oh, it's like that moment in the last interview with Quincy Troop where he says at some point you feel like a broken motor. You can only go to Texas so many times, that he's constantly repeating himself over and over and over and over again. And the students were just overwhelmed by the insight and its relevance to what they were experiencing. Now, it seems as if he has become a ready at hand resource. He's in the canon in a different sort of way now. And I think what I've tried to do with Begin Again, I mean, my answers are too long, I'm sorry. What I've been trying to do with Begin Again, because the spine of the book is No Name in the Street. The heart of the book is the later Baldwin. And the idea is that you can't turn the later Baldwin into Santa Claus. It's just not possible. Right? The rage is just dripping from the page. And so the fact that they are embracing the entirety of the corpus, not just Go Tell It on the Mountain and Notes of a Native Son or Giovanni's Room, but actually If Beale Street Could Talk and No Name and The Devil Finds Work and The Evidence of Things Not Seen. So he's become a kind of ready resource in the canon to imagine American democracy anew, it seems to me.
So let's take those two moments a bit further. So the 2016 with your students, the oh my God, he said, and and again and again and again and again and again for over this 30-year period before they're reading it, and a moment now of saying, oh, here it is for us, right, in this canon, in our moment. And think about this past summer, and think about with us, or the the moments we seemed to have of a kind of willingness for how am I going to say this? So in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, a sense that there might be an opening for a kind of recognition of what should have been long recognized. And then whether we moved from that moment into a complacency, that's not what you're saying. You're hearing from your students in a way. So just talk about, again, I would take you, it's obvious why your book got pushed up at the time it did, right? It arrived at a moment of being something to hold on to and say, here is both extraordinary challenge, truth, and hope of a sort. So
yeah. You know, I think my students know America's broken. Even though Amanda Gorham said it's not broken, it's unfinished. But they are, your students, I think, are, one way to describe them, they are members of the catastrophic generation. They have come of age in the midst of cascading crises. Whether it's the Great Recession, whether it's mass murder or student or school murders, whether it's you know, a storm that's supposed to come every 100 years, they seem to come every season. The planet is screaming. A global pandemic that has killed more people in less than, you know, has killed close to 500,000 people in less than a year. Credit card, student loan debt surpassing credit card debt, economy in tatters. I mean, this is what they know. They know the country's broken. And some of them are reaching for different sorts of languages. Some of them are trying to become are reaching for progressive languages, and whatever we mean by progressive, I'm not sure. Others are reaching for older language. I keep telling people Dylan Roof was not a baby boomer. The Proud Boys aren't baby boomers. The Boogaloo Boys aren't baby boomers. So some people are reaching for older languages, turning to fascism and authoritarianism, right? So there's this sense in which the students know the country is broken. And Baldwin gives them an account of why, right? But he's also asking them to do something that requires more than just simply an acknowledgement of that fact. Because Americans have a tendency to want to pat themselves on the back when we acknowledge such things. And this goes to the first part of the question, Madam President. The first part is, you know, there's a sociological paradox, as Larry Bobo talks about it. And the paradox is, you see in American opinion data, opinion poll data about Americans' attitudes around race, you see a kind of progressive improvement. So American views of school segregation in 1968 is very different than in 1978 or 1988. You know, most people would say we don't agree with these sorts of things. But the paradox is that as there's been improvement in opinion data, public opinion data around race, there is relatively little movement around policy to remedy racial inequality. So although you might have the data showing that people agree with X, that schools shouldn't be segregated, they more than likely disagree with policy remedies to desegregate schools, like busing, for example, right? So here we are in the summer, last summer, and suddenly Black Lives Matter as a phrase has morphed from a kind of indication of you know, potential, you know, anarchists or disruptors of the country to a phrase that comes out of the mouth of Mitt Romney, that's being used by corporations that we see at the, the banner of Google. So Black Lives Matter is supposedly an the acceptance of Black Lives Matter is an indication that somehow there's an opening, something has changed. But remember the paradox, right? That there could be an accept or change in so-called responses to public opinion data, but no substantive change with regards to policy, right? So Baldwin demands what he calls tapping the root, moving beyond the surface. And so I think that's a long-winded answer, but I get you. I hope you get the point. Yeah, I'll stop.
Um, Eddie, you can talk as long as you want with any of these.
No, I can't. We got a whole
because there's so many ways to follow. And I think the point what you were just taking us through of the shift in opinion without the accompanying shift in policy, or the apparent shift in opinion, right? Or even the in that shifting opinion that you described, the more a phrase is said, the less trenchant the phrase becomes in its urgency potentially. So you also share the Baldwin quote, "Hope is born every day." So where did you find put that in the context of what you just said?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reason why I turned to No Name in the Street as the anchor, beyond the fact that I've been teaching it for all of these years, is that it's the first book Baldwin writes after he tries to commit suicide in 1969. It's the first book after the assassination of Dr. King. And at the level of form, at the formal level, the book is all about trauma, the fracturing of memory, right? The way in which wound and pain overdetermine recollection. I can see when I read No Name in the Street, I can see Toni Morrison sitting down in the book, and I could see how it shows up in Beloved. Right? The way in which she's grappling with memory, Baldwin is doing so, and I'm dying to get my hands on his copy of Proust, right? Because he's grappling with Proust in the text in very interesting sorts of ways, right? Now, the reason why I bring that up is that Baldwin is trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. The nation has not only betrayed the Black freedom struggle, but people are dead. This is not an abstraction. Medgar is dead in 63. So when you read the essay, Nothing Personal, which is a part of that photography book with Richard Avingdon, that essay is a eulogy in part to, Medgar Evers, right? When you read or watch, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and you hear the shift in tone and change, Baldwin is grappling with what's happening in real time, right? And so No Name in the Street is this effort to make sense of what has happened in compressed, what happened between the moment he landed in Montgomery with that big ass typewriter and seeing the hatred in these police officers, these sheriffs' faces, to the moment when Angela Davis and Bobby Hutton, they were still crawling around their mother's knee. And now these people are either dead or on the cover of Newsweek magazine as on the FBI's most wanted list. What has happened between then and now? So what does he do? So he's in Istanbul trying to pick up the pieces. This is where he finishes No Name in the Street. 1970, a reporter from Ebony comes to interview him. He's at a party. Baldwin is holding forth. He's prone to hold forth in these amazingly dramatic ways, right? He probably has a glass of Johnny Walker Black in his hand and a cigarette over here. I can imagine it like it's up there. And the reporter asks him about hope. And Baldwin says, hope is invented every day. And what he means by this is a long-winded way to get to the question, but what he means by it, it's a blues-soaked hope. When you have to invent hope every day, that means you're holding off despair every day. When you have to invent hope every day, you're trying to figure out how to get up every day. You see? And the answer for me as a scholar of African American religion, right, is to think about, that context of the enslaved in this particular relation of domination. There's nothing about her condition that would lead her to believe that her life could be otherwise. But there's something in that moment when somebody stands in front of you and you see the flit of love, a glimmer of love in the eye of the person in front of you. Oh my God, he loves me, although he may be gone tomorrow. Or you hear out in the yard just for a moment that these children suddenly sound like innocent babies laughing. And in that brief moment, hope emerges that becomes the basis for the condition for possibility. So when Baldwin says hope is invented every day, it is the capacity of human beings in the midst of chaos and the absurd to imagine beyond the opacity of that condition, or to put it in an image, right? To be able to swing your feet off the bed and plant it on the floor and get up, even though you know the world is arrayed against you, even though you know you might not make it that day to the end. And so Baldwin says in that moment, hope is invented every day. And the echo is in B.B. King's blues track. Nobody loves me but my mother, but she could be jiving too. You see?
Absolutely. So this is the I have so many directions I could take you. And one of the ones I want to take you to is where you just touched in the way you described that as a scholar of religion, right? And in your very first work, talking about the way that notions of exile in Egypt, and so let's talk about you for a moment in relation to this, and we'll come back to you in relation to James Baldwin. But you go to Moorhead, you spend some time at Temple, you get a PhD at Princeton in religion. You go to work at a job at Bowdoin College, and then the Bowdoin story goes that Princeton snatched you back after you'd been at Bowdoin for a while, and here you are, a distinguished professor at Princeton in religion. And at the same time, there's an intersection there with AFAM, Africana, Black studies, that world that over the arc of your career is also moving in the academy, and then you're a public intellectual. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, from a question, the question there is, how does a professor of religion write this book about Baldwin? But then how is it inevitable, given the way that you're intersecting in the academy, that would be the book you're writing? So talk about that positionality and how you think about a little bit where the academy is right now in the ways that you're moving it, not moving it, and where you see your own way there.
Yeah, I never would have entered the field of religion if it wasn't for Cornell West.
Uh-huh.
If Cornell had been in a politics department or a philosophy department, that's where I would have ended up. And then it turned out that, religion encountering Albert Rabbitoe, God bless him, he's in hospice now with dementia. Encountering Al Rabbitoe and Jeffrey Stout, I suddenly got a way to read the world, right? And the religion department at Princeton is a unique space, and particularly the subfield of religion, ethics, and politics. So Princeton has this subfield that looks and feels like political theory in its American iteration in some ways. And that's where I found my feet. So I wrote all of my first year graduate student papers on Ralph Ellison. Lori Balfour, who was in the politics department, she was in our seminars with us, and she ended up writing a dissertation on James Baldwin, which came out as The Evidence of Things Not Said, right? Which is one of the great books on Baldwin and political theory. So we were all in this space, and Baldwin was this resource. At the time, I didn't want to deal with Baldwin because I didn't want to deal with flushed faces and red cheeks, because he was making everyone uncomfortable, and I didn't want to deal with that. And he was making me uncomfortable. But there was this sense that I was in a space where I could actually fulfill my sense of calling, my own sense of vocation. I've always imagined um, speaking to the problems that we all face beyond the narrow confines of the academy. And Cornell provided a certain kind of model for me in this regard. But I always knew that my point of entry to my scholarly career um, would be, the things that mattered to me, right? That I could not be alienated from my work. It would have to matter in my gut. And that meant that African American studies would be at the heart of the project just through a preoccupation with, religion or the philosophy of religion or religion, ethics, and politics in that sense. It also happens to be the case that I was at Princeton at the time. Not that you guys want to hear this genealogy, but I was at Princeton at the time when Cornell was writing the American Evasion of Philosophy. And I got introduced to John Dewey in a way that just blew me away. I mean, I was just blown away. And I did not like Cornell's reading of Dewey. I thought it was too indebted to Richard Rorty. So I was reading Dewey in a very sustained and deep way. So pragmatism became a critical way to how I read, how I do philosophy, how I read the historical archive. And pragmatism, as Dewey understands it, at its best, the pragmatist philosopher at his or her best is the philosopher who is engaged in bringing the full weight of her skill set to bear on the problems of men and women. The arc of the pragmatist philosopher is away from professionalists or narrow professional concerns to the broader concerns of the social world. So here I have my own intuitions about I want to be relevant to this broader issue of justice, my own sense of vocation. I am attracted to a philosophical approach that says to me that if you're going to be a philosopher, son, be a philosopher in a way that's relevant to the problems that everyday ordinary folk face. And then boom, I spent my time trying to fortify the foundation. I still remember when I wrote the last chapter of Exodus. I was walking around the square in Bowdoin, at Bowdoin College. And I remember coming up in my, saying, okay, the tragedy, I'm thinking about tragedy in this way. And that became the epilogue. And in the epilogue of Exodus is the entire corpus sense. Right. So long-winded way. So.
And I'll pull it a circle in here and take us out one other way as you go to Dewey, because the piece you may not know is Sarah Lawrence was founded in 1926, very much on Dewey and principles of education. So this series, Justice, is the fourth in a series that started with democracy and education, taking its title from Dewey. And pulling out from that into ways that we really think about that it's, Dewey's, what's the phrase? Education is life itself, right?
Right. Right.
And so there's a lovely resonance, right, of seeing those come together.
A little kismet here. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Let me take you to one other as I know we have an audience eager to engage with you as well. So I'm going to take you to one more question from me. But as we do that, we'll get ready to open our chat. This is for our audience. This is your heads up that chat's opening, into which you can place your questions. If you're students, it would be great if you put SLC in your year, because I always try to make sure we get some student questions in, and in case I don't recognize the name. Alums, if you're proud and it's an I Love Sarah Lawrence moment, you can put your years too. And we will, I will moderate from the chat thematically. We'll try to get as many questions in as we can as we do that. if you can keep them somewhat brief in the chat, it allows us to actually introduce them. And those of you who have been on these Zoom chats, I can get full pretty quickly. So Leslie Lone, who is our virtual producer, will open the chat for us. And I will, as that's happening, ask you a final question from me, Eddie, reserving the right that I may come around. I suppose I should say, Dr. Glaude, esteemed Professor Glaude. Well,
no.
to take a quote again from Baldwin, and as a way of summing up much of this you've touched, but the Baldwin quotation is this: I think the past is all that makes the present coherent, and further, that the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it thoroughly. And of course, this is the quotation you cite. But let me read that and plant it again, and then I'd like to ask you to bring that into our moment. I think the past is all that makes the present coherent, and further, that the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it thoroughly. So here's our moment. There's our how do we assess the past. So reflect on that a bit for and with us.
Yeah, Baldwin is so powerful there. The past is always present because we carry it in us. You know, it moves us about, and as long as we evade, you know, its ugly elements, our ghastly failures, it will move us about in ways that we know not. You know, and it. I mean, in some ways, he's trying to insist upon, right, the conditions for a kind of maturity, right? Because Baldwin wants to suggest, at least as I read him, that this ongoing desire for innocence, which leads us, right, to avoid and to evade what our past actually says about who we are, actually makes us monstrous. It's a condemnation to corruption. It's like being sentenced to Never Never Land, forever lost boys and lost girls who refuse to grow up. So as long as we avoid what has made us who we are, it will haunt. This is the example I use, and I know we got to go to questions in the chat. When my wife and I when we had our first and only child, Langston, who we adore, who can you believe, Amada, who's 25, 24, getting ready to go to law school. I had to ask myself a question. Eddie, are you going to deal with daddy now? Because if you don't, you're going to end up reproducing the very thing with your son that happened to you. You have to do your first works over. I didn't. I was too immature. But by the grace of God, we made our way through. But that's the point, you know, to excavate that cellar that's moving you about, to put it in Jamesian terms, you know. But anyway.
So again, thank you for your willingness to go so many places with me and with us, and to take it in that very personal way there, as well as an extraordinary one. And I think every one of us who is a parent heard our own sense there with you of that generational replication. There's a question from Mary Dillard, who's one of our faculty members, and let's see if we can actually unmute Mary and let her just ask her question. Can we do that, Leslie? If not, I'll read it, but we'll watch and see. Mary's the director of our Women's History program.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I was listening to what you were saying about teaching and your students. And the question that I wrote is that given that the US has never had a real reckoning with our violent history, are you ever surprised that students are surprised at the prescience and the ongoing relevance of Baldwin.
Am I ever surprised at the students' surprise?
Right. For some people, it's a discovery, right? For other people, his work is a rediscovery. But part of what everyone is rediscovering is the extent to which this nation has not changed or does not change, or how far it's willing to go.
Right. I'm trying to think about it in relation to my students, because when the question is asked in a different context, the answer is no, right? In fact, it becomes a moment where I either smirk or frown or scowl. That Wolf Blitzer moment. Is this America? Get your hands off your pearls and vote. Yes, it is America. Come on. How many times are you going to ask that question? But with my students, I can't say for sure. I haven't thought about my emotional reaction in those moments very carefully. So my instinct is to say yes and no, or no and yes. But I have to think about it a bit more.
So we have a question from one of our students, Piper Lewis, senior, in Lita Sizer's class. Piper, do you want to ask your question yourself, or shall I read it? Let's.
I can read it. Hi, I'm Piper. Thank you so much for this talk. I've had to keep my camera off because I keep crying. So thank you. But I'm here with a bunch of students from my class as well as my professor. And in class today, we discussed the fire next time, and we were trying to parse out what makes Baldwin a political radical. And so I was just wondering how you would characterize Baldwin's radicalism.
Well, I mean, I can characterize it in a number of different directions, in a number of different ways, right? So Baldwin is going to reject any political system that doesn't presuppose the sacrality of human being. So any political system that presupposes the disposability of people, he's going to reject. And remember, the young Baldwin, for a moment, although he could never be ideological in any rigid way, was a socialist. He joined the Young Socialists. And you also remember that at the later Baldwin, you haven't read him yet, hopefully you have, you will, right, said that he agreed with Bobby Seale that America needed a kind of Yankee Doodle socialism. So in our traditional understandings of what constitutes political radicalism, Baldwin's going to reject any kind of political system that doesn't affirm the sacrality of human being, that doesn't organize itself in such a way that insists on the dignity and standing of every human being, no matter their zip code, no matter who they love, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their gender or their ability, right? But there's something even more radical about Baldwin's position, in my view, and that is the way in which he embraces a notion of love. You see, I just reached for my Baldwin. He reaches, there's a sense in which Baldwin wants to insist that this notion of love is much more radical. This is not just simply agape, right? Remember that last line in The Fire Next Time? When we, like the relative few among us who like lovers, will achieve our country. And we tend to run past that like lovers thing, right? What does he mean by like lovers? That's not agape. That's not philia. That's eros. What is that? That's about vulnerability. That's like that moment when you're standing before your lover and you don't have any, and all your blemishes, all your faults and foibles are right in your full view, and you risk a kind of vulnerability in the name of love. He says, you know what love is when someone is on top of you. Right? This is Baldwin. This is Baldwin's point, right? And he says he also knows what an unloving touch is. So he's trying to insist on this notion of love. There's this line in this essay. I'm going to find it. Fifth Avenue, downtown, I think. The country will not change, he says, until it re-examines itself and discovers what it really means by freedom. And at the heart of that formulation is this willingness to allow love to evidence itself. And that's not an abstract formulation. So there's the politics, Piper, that I'm talking about, that's radical. But what's fundamentally radical, right, is to actually embrace what love demands and requires of us. That's a different way of being in the world, it seems to me. I agree with that. I do. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for that question. I wish I was a fly on the wall when I talked about fire next time. Yeah, go ahead. I'm
Go ahead.
sorry.
Well, next time we'll get you here longer, and you can be in the class and also be a fly on the wall. All right. So that's the invitation to come. I'm going to put together a couple of questions, both from students, from Lily and from Tyler. Lily says this in the chat, that she was never lucky enough to encounter Baldwin's work in high school, and has had many conversations with friends who haven't read Baldwin until college. And so, what do you think about why Baldwin isn't taught as much in high school environments? And then, related, in my mind, at least to that, is Tyler's question about other authors with similarly relevant insight, right? So, how do we think about that?
Constellation of folks, yeah.
Constellation of when and how people are exposed in what context? Why isn't
Yeah, Baldwin is hard, and he's hard for. I can imagine he's very hard for that AP teacher. You see, I don't know if you've seen that horrible TikTok of the AP government teacher. Oh my God, it's so. But he's hard because he's going to force you to grapple with some things that, if you don't have um, the wherewithal, you will get overrun, or you won't get it. You will, I mean, look, it's like high school students reading Self-Reliance by Emerson, and you get this kind of adolescent reading. Oh, I'm going to be self-reliant and do, as opposed to actually reading what Emerson is doing. You don't get it, right? I mean, the exposure is important, but folks aren't reading Emerson really, really seriously in high school in some ways, right? So I think I don't know what I would have done if I would have encountered him in high school seriously. So there's that. You could imagine what it would mean to read Giovanni's Room in high school, to encounter what's going on really and go tell it on the mountain. What's really happening and go tell it on the mountain, right? Or to read Notes of a Native Son or Fire Next Time in high school. So I think there's, I mean, you could teach Go Tell It on the Mountain, but I think it's an indication of how difficult Baldwin is, because he's going to demand something of the teacher and the student that he's demanding of the nation. And not everybody's ready for that, right? So it's like teaching Blue as I or Beloved in high school. Some folk ain't ready for it, to put it to put it crudely. The second part of the question, Doc, is there's a constellation of writers. I think it's important. I was writing Begin Again at the same time that Imani Perry was finishing up Lorraine Hansberry, Looking for Lorraine. And they are close partners. And Looking for Lorraine as a biography is just exquisite. It's beautiful. We're writing partners. And I think, Baldwin is thinking with her in very interesting sorts of ways. So I would urge, just as a gesture, right, to kind of think about Baldwin and Lorraine together. I came across this letter. Imani Professor Perry calls it Baldwin begging, right? And she's actually quoting Lorraine Hansberry, his begging letters, trying to get Lorraine to read one of his plays and to place it, to put it in the hands of some folks. But they're thinking at a different level of sophistication that it seems to me incredibly relevant to our moment. Incredibly relevant to our moment.
There are a couple of 2 or 3 questions in our chat, which I think speak again to both your work on Baldwin, but also the way in which you've opened yourself up to us as a parent, and asking about how how a Black parent teaches their child not to despise themselves, how with the banality of things that are around us, and either where you see that as drawing on or out of Baldwin or in other places um, in this moment in time. Yeah.
You know, it's a hard question to answer for a variety of reasons, right? I think I need to answer it, but sometimes I'm reluctant to answer it because I want to ask the other question is how are you teaching your kids not to be white? What are you teaching them, you know? Because I have to teach my child, I had to teach my child how not to despise himself because he's had to enter a world that is in some ways organized by people who are raised by people who aren't having the talk with them, you know? So so there's that moment. But you know, you try to do these things, right? We named him Langston Ellis after Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison. So every time we said, and the idea, and if we were gonna have a girl, I remember we were gonna name the girl Anna Julia after Anna Julia Cooper, but we would call her AJ, which is my big brother, right? But she was gonna be named Anna Julia, and the point was that whenever you say your name, wind is beneath your wings. Whenever somebody says Langston, you had to explain, you knew who called you into the world, the tradition out of which you come. And then there are these moments that aren't so benign, moments that happen out of fear. Like the moment when a child almost steps out into the street and gets hit and the parent snatches them back and there's a violent reaction, fear, right? So I remember down the street, a neighbor's kid got caught smoking weed. And the police officer brought him home. And, you know, I'm a Princeton professor. My son's godfather is Cornell West. He went to a private school, Princeton Day School, suburban life. Now, this is what I did. I screamed, I yelled upstairs, Langston, get down here. And he runs down the stairs in his pajamas and Birkins. I don't know what the hell he had on. He just looked like a suburban kid. And I said, come here. And he said, what? I didn't do anything. I said, just come here. And I said, look down there. And he said, what? Oh, they got him. Oh. And he's thinking about the neighbor getting in trouble. And then he catches my eye. And I said, they wouldn't have brought you home to me. I would have had to come get you. Or the time, I'm sorry, I'm telling these stories because I'm trying to answer the question. Or the time when I found out that I was elected the president of the American Academy of Religion. And I called my mama because I'm a mama's boy. And I got off the phone telling her, Mama, you know, this Moss Point kid from Moss Point is the president of the largest body of scholars of religion in the world. And then I got a call from my baby. He's at Brown. And I hear it in his voice. I said, what's wrong? He says, Dad, I was doing a class assignment with my girlfriend, and the police cruiser drives by and then hangs a Yui and drives up on the sidewalk. And he comes out and he says, who are you and why are you here? And I tell him, I'm a Brown student and I'm here doing an assignment for my anthropology class. And then the officer leans over, Daddy, and he tells me that the park closes at 9. And I said, yes, sir, I know, but it's only 6. And then the other officer, Daddy, comes around with his hands on his weapon. And they both lean in to tell me that the park closes at 9. And I have to tap my girlfriend and tell her, we got to go. And I'm thinking, what if he didn't? What if he had a bad day? What if he responded wrong in that moment? I would have lost my baby, right? So part of how to raise a kid in these moments is to figure out how to keep the world, the nastiness of the world, from taking root in their spirits. Another example really quickly. He's home for a summer. He's interning in this public advocacy group, and they're going to lobby at Trenton, and he's all excited. He has on that tight H&M suit, you know, them tight suits that these young people wear that I don't know how to get it on. And he's going to get in his, and he's 6'2" with these tight suit, and he's all happy. They're going to lobby criminal justice reform. We're going to lobby at Trenton. And he gets in his little Honda and he's driving. And then this kid walks into the house and his eyes are blazing red. And I said, what happened? Daddy, I tried to park and a police officer starts screaming at me, just yelling and cussing at me. And then he tells me to go someplace else. And then as I try to drive to another, I get stopped by another police officer there. And then he starts screaming and cussing and yelling and telling me. Then he tells me to go park somewhere else. And so I said, I'm just trying to get to work. And they yell and they tell me to go. And then I got stopped again, Dad. And you know what he asked me? He asked me, who's my PO? Who's my fucking PO, Dad? His parole officer. And this 6'2" boy is crying and he's so angry, you know? And what do I have to do? I have to figure out in this moment, how do I keep this from taking root such that the rage will overwhelm? And he ends up getting killed one day. So, you know, I went and got the 25 McCallum. Let's talk about this. So the answer to the question is, in short, a bit of grace and being deliberate in those moments when the world impinges upon how they understand themselves. And trying desperately to keep it from metastasizing and to overwhelming the soul.
Thank you. Thank you. It's extraordinary story. I'll turn to Scott Shushan, who's a faculty member in philosophy. Scott, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
No questions about philosophy, Scott.
Sure. Well, you mentioned Dewey, of course. There's my picture. Sorry. My babe's in the other room. I got to go do bedtime in a minute, but I'm curious about the way you understand Baldwin as offering the possibility of change, of offering both for different audiences and for different ways, but a sense of, you mentioned the word reflection earlier, and that's one way that we could anticipate change, but then also maybe in unreflective ways. You talked about memory or habits. So therefore, like, what is Baldwin, or how do you understand the capacity of Baldwin to offer change, offer us hope in reading it? That's not trivial, that's meaningful. Because you also talked about the difference between changing minds and then policy change. So in the sense of like practical change opposed to just ideas.
Right. So if I understand the question, let me come at it in a series of in a couple of ways, right? So I believe that, you know, policy change can create the conditions under which one can imagine oneself differently. Right? That if we had different zoning laws, for example, that led to the construction or the building of different kinds of neighborhoods that could occasion different kinds of interactions, right? The way, if we found a series of policy decisions that would interrupt, right, the ways in which our society is segregated so that we could figure out a different way of being together, that could have an impact on my self-conception, right? That there are ways in which we can change the self that isn't driven by something internal, but driven by what external changes, right? That can then be the occasion for the kind of reflection that could generate deep and lasting change. I think so. And the way in which I'm thinking about this is how I read Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct. This is a different sort of argument we could have, right? That is to say, I use this example all the time. I hated waking up and putting my feet on cold floor because my house shoes would be way over there. So I got in the habit of every night before I went to bed, I would put my house shoes in a particular place such that when I put my feet down, I was suddenly in my house shoes, right? So I think there are ways in which we can change the external environment that can then have impacts on how we actually live our lives. And habit formation is key in this regard, right? Also, I think, these occasions for internal reflection, right? Trying to figure out or answer the question of who do we take ourselves to be, and to try to do so honestly can also be occasions for fundamental and significant change and long-lasting change. That it can actually be driven from an interior space, right? That's really important. And Baldwin is constantly making this move. And we might describe it, Scott, as a kind of a move by way of analogy, right? He's going to deal with what it means to grapple with one's own pain, to get to engage in this kind of critical self-examination in order to reach for a different self, to echo Emerson's language, right? To leave a particular self behind, to engage in this perfectionist enterprise. But then he's going to analogize that to the state itself. What we need to do to reach for a higher self by leaving an older self behind. He's going to suggest that the country do something similar, right, in a certain sort of way. So he's going to demand of us a certain kind of reflection that's at the heart of a perfectionist impulse. And then he's going to analogize it to the nation, right? So I'm answering it in a convoluted way, but the first answer is to say, I think policy can become the conditions under which we can set the conditions under which we can change how we live with each other. And that can be long lasting. And critical self-examination, right? Grappling with fractured memories, dealing explicitly with habits that move us about, because habits can become objects of cognitive scrutiny, in my view, right? Or objects of reflection, right? How we deal with those things can matter to the kinds of in terms of the kinds of persons we take ourselves to be. I think that was a bit muddled, but I think you can see where I'm trying to go. But I think Scott is dealing with his little one in this moment.
Well, it's the world of multitasking on Zoom.
Yeah. I'm surprised my baby dog hasn't burst, dramatically opened the doors to my office.
We'll have those moments. We'll have somebody that's on mute moment and all the rest. Yvonne Isaac, who is one of our alums from the class of 71 in Atlanta, that he was an observer and a public intellectual working in a white space. Thoughts?
That he was an observer and an intellectual working in a white. Say that again.
So she says she remembers the criticism at the time was that he was an observer and a public intellectual working in a white space.
Yeah, he was caught between the Scylla of Black Power and the Charybdis of a certain kind of fame, right? In a certain sort of way. Baldwin was always misfitted. It's like that criticism of Langston Hughes of Jimmy, that, he really he wasn't really in the community, as it were. And so there was this sense that he was always grappling with his own sense of self-hatred because, he was the darling of the New York intellectuals who in some ways gave him this platform. I don't think it was true then. And I don't think it was right, more in terms of the assessment that supposedly was to follow from the characterization, right? That is to say that if Baldwin was, writing in a predominantly white world, that somehow that meant that his description of Black life and description of the United States was somehow flawed or was in error. I don't think that's right either. I think his misfittedness is important to understanding his voice.
Well, that misfittedness, and you took it up earlier in terms of intersections of gender and sexuality as well, with race, place, intellectual, and there are a couple of questions in the chat about that. One, Juliet Holiday. Juliet, who is also one of our seniors, do you want to read your question? And there may be a moment, Juliet, when you say, no, just read it for me. But Juliet, would you like to read your question?
Sure, I'm happy to just read it out loud for you. So I also come from Piper's class, the same class where we just spoke about the fire next time today. And a lot of us were wondering about just sort of Baldwin's sort of perceptions of gender, because we noticed how women seem to sort of fade in the background, particularly in the scene where he is at the dinner party with Elijah Muhammad. So after working so closely with him for so long, what have you discovered about Baldwin's own perceptions and perspectives about the political and social organizations of gender, specifically intersecting with race in the US? And how do you think he felt about what he witnessed in regards to the treatment of Black women?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because his view of gender categories is very sophisticated. When you read the essay "The Male Prison" or you read American Freaks, he understands very clearly, right, how the work that these categories are doing, right, the negative work, the insidious work that these categories are doing. But in his public speaking and even in his writing, there's oftentimes these kind of these crude moments where he inhabits a kind of patriarchal world, right? As if he's trying to account for the inability of his stepfather to take care of his woman and his 9 kids, and but you know, this sort of thing, and it's precisely in the way in which he inhabits that space, which oftentimes betrays the kind of nuanced way he actually understands gender and sexuality, right? That opens him up to the kind of criticism that Audre Lorde levied. I mean, when you get a chance, Julia, read the full exchange between Audre Lorde and Jimmy Baldwin. Lorde hands him his behind brilliantly. And for me, one of the more liberating moments in writing this book was an encounter between, I don't know if you've seen the exchange between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni, that interview, and the way in which, I mean, Nikki Giovanni is young and brash, and that moment when she says, lie to me. You know, you go home, you go to work and you lying, and then you come home and you take it out on me. Lie to me. And Baldwin is confused because he's been running that line where he inhabits this kind of patriarchal space and what happens to the man. And she hits him with this move. And Baldwin is completely flummoxed. I love that word, right? So I think it's complicated how he renders, how he thinks about Black women in particular, because they often kind of, you know, come in the form of the way in which he renders Bertus, his mother, the way in which he's thinking about his sisters, Gloria and his younger sister, right? It has this element that doesn't rise to the level of Baldwin's analysis, if that makes sense. But again, close partner was Lorraine, so he knows how to do it. He's making some choices, I think. I don't know if that's an answer, but you get I think it's the beginning of an answer.
Nicole, class of 92, Nicole in the chat has the question, American slavery has been described as a, quote, necessary evil by an elected official. So here we are in Black History Month when we pay tribute to the past and have hope and celebrate the future for descendants of those enslaved on American soil. What do we do when we're surrounded by those with necessary evil attitudes?
Don't pay them no mind. I tried my best, but I was about to kiss my teeth as you were, you know, that's not a civilized Jamaican, that's a, you know, indication of one's bad formation by some people, by kissing one's teeth. No, and this is part of what I try to argue in the book, I've given up trying to convince those who hold such views that they ought not to hold them. I only have a finite amount of civic energy. And I would rather spend my civic energy trying my best to build the New Jerusalem where those sorts of views have no quarter to breathe, as opposed to spending my time trying to convince someone, right, that that's not true. I mean, just on its face, right? You say, oh, it's a necessary evil, but there were all of these people in that context who actually disagreed with that view. So slavery was a necessary, okay, why? Right? Slavery wasn't that slavery was in some ways indicative of the time period. Oh, but there were all of these people within the time period who viewed slavery, American slavery, as in fact evil. Right? So part of what we have to do is to understand when folks are engaging you in bad faith. I have no patience with that any longer. Too much is at stake. Too much is at stake. Think about this moment on the Senate floor in the aftermath of the insurrection. Think about this moment. It's fascinating. Ted Cruz invoked the Compromise of 1877 as a framework to deal with the crises around the certification of the election. And Dick Durbin responds to Cruz in real time. That compromise is precisely why we are here now. What do I do with Ted Cruz in that moment? How do I respond to that claim when it's rooted in such bad faith vis-a-vis me? Well, civic energy is finite. And unless he will hear me say, unless he might feel the full wrath of my rage in that moment. But anyway, I'm going on and on and on. I'm sorry.
No,
It just angers me, right? That we have to tend to these arguments that are baldly, right, motivated by noxious views, that are clearly motivated by noxious views.
We have a question from Linwood Lewis, who is a member of our psychology faculty. Linwood, do you want to do your question yourself?
Okay, and in fact, I'll even show my face, even though I have shaved today. Hello. First of all, thank you for Cristle and Dr. Glaude for your for this conversation. It's been wonderful. My question is about thinking about the underlying despair that is affecting white working class folks, that seems to have culminated in the opioid epidemic and what we call in public health deaths of despair. And when people drug overdoses, alcoholism leading to liver disease, suicide, and what have you. So, how might Baldwin speak to these folks? Particularly because they may not have the framework for parsing the conversation that we're having here in this way. How might Baldwin speak to them in the context of the election in 2016 and the 2020 insurrection?
I'm always hesitant to try to anticipate how Baldwin might respond to X or Y, but I can respond in light of how I read him, if that makes sense. So it is easy, it seems, to reach for the other as the reason for your suffering, as the basis for why you seem not to be able to achieve your dreams. It's easy to blame those who are not like you because you have a model of scarcity at the heart of your vision of this country, right? That there's only so much to go around and they're giving it to these people, these Black and brown people who are jumping ahead of the line. That's easy. It's more difficult to see that there's a certain economic philosophy, ideology that has now turned on you, that views you as disposable. You can see its logic in the hillbilly elegy. You can see it in Charles Murray's latest kind of screed against the lack of values among poor white folk. It seems, according to a certain ideological view, that whiteness isn't the condition for your inclusion in the largesse, right, of economic success, right? Because now they've turned on them, retrieving old languages from back in the day of white trash and the like, right? Attributing a culture of poverty to them. Discourses that have been typically associated with Black folk are now being applied to those folk, right? So, but it's easy in this moment to then turn to the language of race because, you know, as a way to account for your suffering, right? It is the illusion that gives you a sense of safety and comfort. But the thing that we have to say that is very important, I think, Professor Lewis, that has to be mentioned here, is that saying that has never been sufficient. Saying that which seems to be obviously true has never been sufficient. You would say, well, it seems to me, why is it the case that the Free Soil Party never joined with the abolitionists? They were happening at the same time. What do we make of the fact that Tom Watson was once, right, an ardent defender of working farmers, even gathered with white farmers with guns to protect the Black farmer, and later became one of the most vicious racists in the history of the South? It's not enough to just simply say that these elite capitalists are exploiting you and you should be in solidarity with me. That if that was true, I'm saying this to some of my more ideologically rigid Marxist friends, if that was true, it would have happened already. Right? It would have happened, or something deeper is happening here, it seems to me. And you're the psychologist, so I'll let you help me wrap my mind around that.
There's a comment in the chat from Lita Sizer. Lita's actually the faculty member. A couple of students from her class have spoken. Lita, do you want to actually just share that comment with us viva voce? Let's see if we get Lita to read her comment.
Plus, I want to lay eyes on you. You're teaching Jimmy.
Oh my God, I'm such a James Baldwin fan. And my class and I have been texting the whole time saying how wonderful we think you are and what we're going to read next. I'm going to have to change the syllabus. I was just saying how much I really loved the echo in your conclusion of Begin Again to the Fire Next Time. The passage actually that you referenced about lovers needing to come together, and I suspect that Baldwin lovers like I will really appreciate that echo. It's really it's very moving and very helpful right now.
Thank you.
So, thank you. My class is just so ecstatic right now.
Thank you. I can't show you my chill bumps through this thing, but thank you.
No, and sadly, we hit our time right now. But there are lots of echoes of thank yous in the chat. I want to. One was from someone in Virginia who said, "Thank goodness my power stayed on long enough for me to be able to be part of this. What a gift." Eddie, you gave me a gift because reading is something that sometimes I don't have as much time for. So for everybody, if you haven't read Begin Again, strongly recommend that you go out and do that. But thank you. You prompted many conversations on campus, and I know there'll be many to follow. And thank you from Sarah Lawrence around the world for being with us virtually. And we'll get you here in person when we're able.
I'm looking forward to it. And then we can teach Baldwin together. That'll be dope. That'll be wonderful.
We'll get it going. So thank you everybody for being with us tonight. Thank you, Eddie Glaude, for giving us a great conversation.
Thank you. And everybody stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.